The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey like a shroud of history itself. Prince William stood before the ornate mirror in his private chambers, his reflection showing a man who carried the weight of centuries on his shoulders. The golden threads of his ceremonial robes caught the early light, but his eyes held shadows that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. Catherine sat quietly in the corner chair, her own elaborate gown spread around her like spilled champagne. She watched her husband with the keen eye of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of his distress. The way his jaw tightened when he thought no one was looking. The slight tremor in his hands when he reached for his ceremonial sword. The deep breath he took before facing any crowd that would judge not just his actions, but his very soul. "The children are asking questions again," Catherine said softly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them like a chasm. "George wanted to know why Papa looks so sad when he should be happy about becoming king." William's reflection paused in its careful adjustment of the ceremonial collar. His eldest son, barely 11 years old, already carried the burden of understanding that his father's happiness was often sacrificed on the altar of duty. The innocence in George's questions cut deeper than any criticism from Parliament or press. "What did you tell him?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That sometimes the most important jobs in life are also the hardest ones. That Papa loves his country so much, he's willing to carry its problems so that others don't have to." A knock at the door interrupted their private moment. Sir Thomas Whitfield, the king's private secretary, entered with the measured steps of a man who had served 3 monarchs and understood the delicate balance between duty and humanity. "Your Majesty, the Abbey is filled to capacity. Representatives from 196 nations are in attendance. The Archbishop is ready to begin the ceremony when you are." William nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on his reflection. He saw his father's face looking back at him, the same expression Charles had worn during his own coronation just 2 years prior. The weight of expectation, the crushing responsibility of representing not just a nation, but an ideal that seemed increasingly fragile in a modern world. The social media storm had begun before dawn. William's team of digital advisors had briefed him on the trending topics, the hashtags that would define his reign before it even began. Hashtag Not My King competed with hashtag God Save the King in a digital battle that reflected the deep divisions in his kingdom. Critics questioned his readiness, his modern approach to monarchy, his attempts to balance tradition with progress. But it was the personal attacks that cut deepest. Comments about his appearance, his emotional state, even speculation about his marriage and children. The modern monarchy meant living under a microscope that previous generations of royals could never have imagined. Every gesture would be analyzed, every expression dissected by millions of strangers who felt entitled to judge his worthiness. Catherine rose from her chair and approached her husband. Without words, she straightened his collar and smoothed an invisible wrinkle from his sleeve. Her touch was gentle, but sure, a reminder that he was not alone in this moment that would define both their lives forever. "Do you remember what your grandmother told you about courage?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotion William could see in her eyes. "That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important than fear." "What's more important today, William?" He looked past his reflection to meet her eyes directly. "The promise I made to serve. The oath I swore to protect. The future I want to build for our children and for everyone who calls this nation home." Outside their chambers, the world waited. Television cameras from every corner of the globe were positioned to capture every moment of the ceremony. Social media platforms buzzed with real-time commentary from royal watchers, critics, and supporters alike. The weight of history pressed down on the ancient abbey, where kings and queens had been crowned for nearly 1,000 years. But in this quiet moment before the storm, William felt something shift inside him. The fear remained, but it no longer controlled him. The criticism would continue, but it would not define him. He was about to become king not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to try to be better than he was yesterday. The ceremonial procession began in the halls below. The sound of ancient hymns drifted up through the stone corridors, carrying with them the voices of centuries of subjects who had witnessed this same ritual. Some had served with love, others with resignation, but all had participated in the great human experiment of monarchy in a democratic age. William straightened his shoulders and took Catherine's hand. Together, they walked toward the door that would lead them to their destiny. Behind them lay the private fears and doubts that every human carries. Ahead lay the crown, the throne, and the awesome responsibility of serving millions of people who would never know his name was once simply William, a man who loved his family and wanted to make the world a little better than he found it. Sir Thomas waited by the door, his practiced eye noting the transformation that had occurred in the private chambers. The uncertain prince who had entered was now walking out as a king, carrying himself with the quiet dignity that his grandmother had modeled throughout her remarkable reign. The crowd outside the abbey stretches for miles, Sir Thomas reported as they walked. Police estimate over 2 million people have gathered in London alone. The global television audience is expected to exceed 4 billion viewers. 4 billion people. The number seemed impossible to comprehend, each one with their own opinions, their own expectations, their own hopes, and fears for what his reign might bring. Some would judge him harshly before he spoke a single word as king. Others would offer support he had done nothing yet to earn. Most would simply watch and wait to see what kind of man he would prove to be when tested by the ultimate pressure of the crown. As they approached the great doors of the abbey, William could hear the roar of the crowd outside. Cheers mixed with protests, celebration blended with skepticism. The modern monarchy meant ruling over subjects who felt free to voice every opinion, criticism, and doubt. It was messier than the respectful silence his ancestors had commanded, but it was also more honest. Catherine squeezed his hand one final time before they would have to release each other for the ceremony. In her touch, he felt all the love and strength that had carried them through the scandals, the criticism, and the relentless pressure of public life. She would stand beside him through whatever came next, just as she had stood beside him through everything that had brought them to this moment. The great doors opened, and the full weight of destiny rushed in like a tide. The abbey was ablaze with light and color, filled with the most powerful people on earth, all gathered to witness the continuation of a tradition that stretched back through the mists of time. But William's attention was caught by a small section in the front rows where he saw the faces that mattered most. His children sat perfectly still, their young faces serious with the weight of understanding that their lives were changing forever. George, who would one day face this same moment. Charlotte, whose intelligence and spirit reminded him daily of the strong women who had shaped the monarchy. Louis, still young enough to wave at his father with unself-conscious joy. Behind them sat the extended family who had supported him through every trial, the friends who had remained loyal through every scandal, and the advisors who had helped him prepare for this moment when private man would become public symbol. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood at the altar, the ancient crown resting on its ceremonial cushion. The same crown that had touched the heads of his grandmother, his father, and now would rest upon his own. Each coronation had marked not just the beginning of a reign, but the hopes and fears of a nation in that particular moment of history. As William began his slow walk down the aisle, the massive pipe organ filled the abbey with music that seemed to come from heaven itself. The voices of the choir rose in harmony that spoke of faith, tradition, and the enduring human need to believe in something greater than themselves. With each step toward the altar, William felt the transformation completing itself. The doubts and fears that had plagued him in private were not gone, but they were now balanced by a growing sense of purpose. He was walking not just toward a crown, but toward a promise to serve something larger than his own comfort or happiness. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the abbey. History was watching, the future was listening, and the present demanded nothing less than his complete commitment to the oath he was about to take. The ancient words of the coronation ceremony echoed through Westminster Abbey with the weight of centuries. Archbishop Michael spoke each syllable with reverent precision, his voice carrying across the hushed assembly of world leaders, nobility, and carefully selected representatives of the Commonwealth. Every word had been spoken in this same way for generations, connecting William to an unbroken chain of monarchs who had stood where he now stood. But outside the abbey walls, a different kind of ceremony was taking place. The digital age had transformed the coronation from a sacred ritual witnessed by a few hundred into a global spectacle dissected by millions in real time. Social media platforms exploded with commentary that ranged from reverent admiration to brutal criticism. Sarah Chun, a 24-year-old university student in Manchester, watched the ceremony on her laptop while simultaneously posting her reactions on multiple social platforms. Her followers had come to expect her unfiltered commentary on royal events, and she had built a substantial audience by questioning the relevance of monarchy in the 21st century. Look at the cost of this ceremony while people are struggling to pay their heating bills, she typed rapidly. How is this representing modern Britain? Her post was shared hundreds of times within minutes, sparking heated debates and comment threads that stretched across political and generational lines. Older users defended the tradition and pageantry. Younger ones questioned the expense and relevance. The divide wasn't just about the monarchy. It reflected deeper questions about tradition, progress, and what it meant to be British in an increasingly connected world. Meanwhile, in a small village in Wales, retired teacher Margaret Phillips watched the ceremony with tears streaming down her face. At 78, she had witnessed the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II as a young child, and the continuity of tradition filled her with a profound sense of connection to her nation's history. He looks just like his grandmother did, she whispered to her cat, who sat purring in her lap, carrying all that weight with such dignity. Margaret's neighbor, 40-year-old mechanic David Williams, watched through his kitchen window as she dabbed at her eyes. David had little patience for royal ceremonies, but he respected Margaret's devotion. His own feelings about the monarchy were complicated. He appreciated the stability it provided, but questioned whether that stability was worth the cost and inequality it represented. Back in the abbey, William knelt before the archbishop as the most solemn moment of the ceremony approached. The crown that would rest upon his head had been worn by his grandmother for 70 years, and before her, by monarchs whose reigns had shaped the course of world history. The weight of that legacy was both inspiring and terrifying. Catherine watched from her designated seat, her face a careful mask of composure that hid the storm of emotions beneath. She thought of the phone call they had received just hours before the ceremony. Their youngest son Louis had developed a fever and was inconsolable at home with his nanny. The decision to continue with the ceremony while her child was unwell had torn at her maternal instincts, but duty had demanded they proceed. The irony wasn't lost on her that millions of people around the world were watching this moment, while the person she most wanted to be with was a sick 5-year-old who just wanted his mother's comfort. The sacrifice of personal happiness for public duty was a burden she was still learning to carry, even after years of preparation. Prince George sat perfectly still beside his mother, but his young mind was racing with questions he didn't know how to voice. He understood that his father was becoming king, but he was only beginning to grasp what that would mean for his own future. The weight of destiny that now rested on his father's shoulders would one day transfer to his own, a reality that both thrilled and frightened him. In the press section, royal correspondent Emma Bradford typed furiously on her laptop, trying to capture not just the ceremonial elements, but the human moments that would resonate with readers. She had covered the royal family for 15 years, and she recognized the signs of genuine emotion beneath the formal protocols. The new king's hands trembled slightly as he received the orb and scepter, she wrote. These are not just symbolic objects to him. They represent the crushing weight of responsibility for 67 million citizens and the Commonwealth beyond. Her editor in London was simultaneously monitoring social media trends, watching as hashtags rose and fell in real-time popularity. The digital conversation about the coronation was as complex and divided as the nation itself. Hashtag King William trended alongside hashtag Abolish the Monarchy, while hashtag Proud to be British competed with hashtag Republic Now for attention and engagement. The Archbishop raised the St. Edward's crown high above William's head, pausing for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. In that silence, the weight of history pressed down on everyone present. This was the moment when a prince became a king, when a man accepted the burden of embodying a nation's hopes and fears. As the crown touched his head, William felt a profound shift that he hadn't anticipated. The physical weight of the gold and jewels was nothing compared to the metaphysical weight of becoming the living symbol of everything Britain aspired to be. He was no longer just William Wales. He was King William V, defender of the faith, protector of the realm, servant of the people. The congregation rose as one, their voices joining in God Save the King with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some sang with patriotic fervor, others with respectful duty, and a few remained silent in subtle protest. The diversity of response reflected the complex relationship between a modern democratic society and its ancient monarchical traditions. Outside the Abbey, the crowd's reaction was equally mixed. Cheers erupted from dedicated royal supporters who had camped out for days to witness this moment. But scattered throughout the throng were protesters holding signs calling for a republic, their presence a reminder that not all citizens were united in their support for the institution William now embodied. Television cameras captured every angle of the ceremony, but they couldn't capture the internal struggle William experienced as the reality of his new role settled upon him. He thought of his grandmother's advice about the loneliness of leadership, about the necessity of putting the nation's needs above his own desires, about the weight of representing something larger than himself. The ceremony continued with ancient rituals that connected the present moment to 1,000 years of British history. Each element, the anointing with holy oil, the presentation of the regalia, the act of homage from the nobility, reinforced the continuity of tradition even as the world outside changed at an unprecedented pace. Social media commentary grew more intense as the ceremony progressed. Influencers with millions of followers shared their real-time reactions, creating echo chambers of both support and criticism. The immediacy of digital communication meant that public opinion was forming and evolving in real time, putting unprecedented pressure on the new monarch before his reign had even officially begun. In households across Britain and the Commonwealth, families gathered around televisions and devices, their reactions as diverse as their circumstances. Some watched with reverence and pride, others with cynical amusement, and many with the complicated mixture of skepticism and grudging respect that characterized the modern relationship with monarchy. The global audience was equally divided. In former colonies, the ceremony stirred complex emotions about imperial history and ongoing relationships with Britain. In allied nations, it represented stability and continuity in an uncertain world. In competing powers, it was viewed as an anachronistic display of inherited privilege that had no place in the modern world. As the final moments of the coronation approached, William felt the full weight of his transformation settling upon him. He was no longer a private individual who happened to hold a public role. He was a public symbol who would struggle to maintain any private identity. Every decision he made, every word he spoke, every gesture he displayed would be analyzed through the lens of his role as king. Catherine caught his eye across the Abbey, offering a small smile that reminded him he wasn't alone in this journey. Their partnership had been tested by years of public scrutiny, but it had emerged stronger and more committed. She would share this burden with him, just as she had shared every other challenge they had faced together. The Archbishop's voice rose in the final blessing, his words carrying across the Abbey and beyond to the millions watching around the world. The ceremony was ending, but William's true test was just beginning. He would now have to prove himself worthy of the crown that rested upon his head, not through birthright or ceremony, but through the choices he made and the leader he chose to become. As the recessional music began, William rose from the throne and took his first steps as king. The crown felt heavy upon his head, but his stride was steady and sure. He had accepted the burden of monarchy, and now he would have to learn to carry it with the grace and dignity his position demanded. The social media eruption that would define the early days of his reign had already begun, but William was determined to focus on substance over spectacle, on service over celebrity, on the long-term welfare of his people over the short-term fluctuations of public opinion. His reign had officially begun, and with it, a new chapter in the ancient story of British monarchy. How that chapter would be written remained to be seen, but William was committed to writing it with integrity, compassion, and an unwavering dedication to the oath he had just taken before God and his people. Within minutes of King William's coronation concluding, the digital tsunami began in earnest. Hannah Mitchell, the palace's head of digital communications, watched in real time as the internet exploded with reactions that ranged from adoring praise to vicious criticism. Her team of 12 analysts worked frantically to monitor trending topics across 17 different platforms in 23 languages. We're seeing unprecedented engagement levels. Her deputy, Marcus Rodriguez, reported while scrolling through data that updated every second. But the sentiment analysis is showing deep polarization. For every positive comment, there are 3 negative ones, and they're getting increasingly personal. The criticism wasn't just about monarchy as an institution. It was targeting William personally. Comments about his appearance during the ceremony focused on moments when his composure had cracked, when the weight of emotion had shown through his carefully maintained royal demeanor. Screenshots of his face during particularly solemn moments were being shared with mocking captions that questioned his fitness to rule. Dr. Rebecca Thornfield, a constitutional historian at Oxford University, watched the digital chaos unfold from her study. She had spent 30 years analyzing the relationship between monarchy and public opinion, but nothing in her research had prepared her for the speed and intensity of social media reaction to royal events. The monarchy has survived civil wars, 2 world wars, and social revolutions, she murmured to herself while scrolling through endless streams of commentary. But can it survive the internet? Her concern wasn't just academic. The immediate, unfiltered nature of social media meant that public opinion could shift dramatically within hours rather than months or years. A single viral video or meme could damage the monarchy's reputation more effectively than years of newspaper criticism in previous generations. Meanwhile, in a modest flat in Birmingham, 28-year-old teacher Amara Okafor found herself reluctantly defending the new king in a heated online discussion that had started as casual commentary among her university friends. As a black woman whose grandparents had immigrated from Nigeria, her relationship with the monarchy was complicated by colonial history and ongoing questions about Commonwealth relationships. "I'm not saying I support monarchy as a system," she typed carefully, "but attacking him personally for showing emotion during his coronation feels wrong. Wouldn't we criticize him if he showed no feeling at all?" Her comments sparked dozens of replies that revealed the complex generational and cultural divide surrounding the royal family. Younger users questioned why anyone should defend inherited privilege, while older commenters appreciated her nuanced perspective on the human elements of the ceremony. The conversation reflected broader tensions within British society about identity, tradition, and change. The coronation had become a Rorschach test for deeper anxieties about the nation's direction and values. Back at Buckingham Palace, William sat in his private study, still wearing his coronation robes, but having removed the heavy crown that now rested on its ceremonial stand. Catherine sat across from him, both of them exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day. Their phones buzzed constantly with messages from family, friends, and officials, but they had agreed to take an hour of private time before facing the public duties that awaited them. Hannah's team is reporting that the social media response is more intense than they anticipated. Catherine said gently, not wanting to add to his burden, but knowing he needed to understand the challenges ahead. William nodded slowly, his face showing the strain of processing both the magnitude of his new role and the immediate criticism it had generated. I knew this would be difficult, but I didn't expect it to feel so personal. It's as if becoming king somehow gave everyone permission to dissect every aspect of who I am as a person. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that this was the most connected generation of royals in history, yet they had never felt more isolated from their subjects. Social media had created an illusion of intimacy that was actually a form of distance. Millions of people felt entitled to judge them based on carefully curated glimpses of their lives. In a university dormitory in Edinburgh, politics student James MacLeod was live-streaming his reaction to the coronation aftermath for his modest but engaged following. As a Scottish Republican, he had strong opinions about the ceremony and its implications for his nation's future. The whole spectacle proves how out of touch the institution is, he said to his camera while reading through social media responses. But what's more concerning is how this is dividing people. Look at these comment sections. Families are arguing, friends are unfollowing each other. Is this really what national unity looks like? James represented a growing segment of young Britons who viewed monarchy not with the reverence of their grandparents or even the resigned acceptance of their parents, but with genuine bewilderment at its continued existence. His live stream attracted viewers who shared his perspective, creating an echo chamber of Republican sentiment that felt more significant and widespread than it actually was. This was the new challenge facing the monarchy. Social media algorithms that amplified extreme views and created false impressions of public opinion. The loudest voices weren't necessarily representative, but they dominated the digital conversation in ways that traditional polling couldn't capture. Meanwhile, in a care home in Cornwall, 85-year-old former naval officer Commander Peter Hartwell watched news coverage of the social media reaction with growing alarm. He had served under Queen Elizabeth II for 30 years and viewed the monarchy as one of the last stable institutions in an increasingly chaotic world. They don't understand what they're destroying, he said to his daughter during their daily phone call. The young people tearing down everything on the internet, they have no idea what it means to have continuity and stability. They'll miss it when it's gone. His daughter, a social worker in her 50s, found herself caught between her father's traditionalism and her own children's progressive views. The generational divide wasn't just about politics. It was about fundamentally different understandings of authority, tradition, and social change. The palace communications team worked through the night, crafting responses that could address the criticism without appearing defensive or out of touch. Every statement would be analyzed for tone, subtext, and political implications. The traditional royal approach of dignified silence was increasingly difficult to maintain in an era that demanded immediate responses and constant engagement. William's first test as king came sooner than anyone had anticipated. A video clip from the coronation ceremony began going viral, a moment when he had briefly closed his eyes during the archbishop's blessing, his face showing vulnerability and exhaustion. The clip was being shared with captions that questioned his emotional fitness for leadership. "He looks like he's going to cry," read one comment that had been shared thousands of times. Is this really the strong leader Britain needs? But something unexpected began to happen as the clip spread. Other users started responding with empathy rather than mockery. Parents wrote about the pressure of important moments in their children's lives. Veterans shared experiences of carrying overwhelming responsibility. Healthcare workers talked about the weight of life and death decisions. The conversation began to shift from criticism to compassion, from judgment to understanding. The same vulnerability that some saw as weakness, others recognized as humanity. The digital mob that had formed to tear down the new king began to splinter as more nuanced voices entered the conversation. Dr. Sarah Whitman, a psychologist who specialized in leadership and trauma, wrote a Twitter thread that was shared thousands of times. What we're seeing isn't weakness. It's a human cost of inherited responsibility. This man didn't choose to be born into this role, but he's accepting its burdens with visible emotion. Shouldn't we want leaders who feel the weight of their decisions? Her perspective resonated with users who had initially joined the criticism, but were beginning to question the mob mentality that social media could create. The conversation about monarchy evolved into broader discussions about empathy, leadership, and the difference between strength and stoicism. Catherine watched the tide of online opinions slowly shift, recognizing the unpredictable nature of digital discourse that could destroy a reputation in hours or rehabilitate it just as quickly. The key was not trying to control the conversation, but engaging with it authentically and trusting that their genuine intentions would eventually be recognized. Late that night, William made a decision that surprised his communications team. He wanted to record a brief, informal video message acknowledging the day's emotions and thanking people for their varied perspectives on the coronation. It would be unscripted, personal, and vulnerable, exactly the kind of content that traditional palace protocol would discourage. "Your Majesty," Hannah Mitchell said carefully, "this could be risky. If the message doesn't land correctly, it could intensify the criticism rather than address it." "That's a risk I'm willing to take," William replied. "If I'm going to be king in the digital age, I need to find a way to be authentic within that medium. Hiding behind palace walls isn't going to work anymore." The video, recorded in the same study where he had processed the day's events with Catherine, was released at midnight. In it, William spoke directly to the camera about the weight of the day, the honor of serving, and his awareness of the diverse opinions about monarchy in modern Britain. "I know not everyone supports the institution I now represent," he said, his voice steady but warm. "I respect that perspective, even as I commit to serving all citizens regardless of their views on the crown." Today was overwhelming. The responsibility, the history, the awareness that I'm now accountable to 67 million people with different hopes and fears and dreams. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, the video had been viewed 10 million times. Comments poured in from around the world, with many expressing surprise at the king's directness and vulnerability. The conversation shifted again, this time toward discussion of what modern leadership could look like in an age of digital transparency. Young people who had been harsh critics found themselves reconsidering their positions. Older supporters appreciated his acknowledgement of different viewpoints. The video became a case study in authentic communication that transcended traditional political divisions. As dawn broke over London, the digital storm that had threatened to define William's early reign had transformed into something more complex and ultimately more hopeful. The social media eruption had revealed deep divisions in British society, but it had also demonstrated the possibility for genuine dialogue and mutual understanding in the digital age. The new king's willingness to engage directly with criticism, to show vulnerability while maintaining dignity, and to acknowledge complexity rather than demand simplicity had set a tone for his reign that traditional coronation ceremonies could never achieve. The internet had tested him within hours of becoming king, and he had passed that test not by trying to control the narrative, but by engaging with it honestly and courageously. It was a lesson that would serve him well in the challenging years ahead. 3 weeks after the coronation, King William sat in his private office at Kensington Palace, reviewing the detailed analysis his communications team had prepared about the ongoing social media response to his reign. The numbers were staggering. His midnight video message had been viewed over 100 million times across all platforms, translated into 47 languages, and had sparked conversations in countries he had never visited. Hannah Mitchell entered the room with her weekly digital report, but her expression suggested this meeting would be different from their previous discussions. "Your Majesty, I think we've reached a turning point. The data is showing something we've never seen before in royal communication." She placed a tablet on his desk showing engagement metrics that represented more than statistics. They represented a fundamental shift in how the monarchy was perceived by different generations and communities around the world. The authenticity of your coronation video has created what we're calling a vulnerability dividend, Hannah explained. Trust metrics among 18 to 34-year-olds have increased by 60% since the ceremony. More importantly, the conversations have evolved from criticism of the institution to genuine engagement with its potential for positive change. Williams studied the data, but his mind was on the human stories behind the numbers. Letters had been pouring into the palace from people who had never written to royalty before. Young parents expressing solidarity with the challenges of balancing public duty and family life, teachers discussing the importance of showing emotion and leadership, veterans sharing their experiences with the weight of responsibility. One letter in particular had moved him deeply. It came from a 16-year-old girl in Wales named Megan Hughes, who had been struggling with anxiety about her upcoming university applications and the pressure to appear perfect to admissions committees. Seeing you show real emotion during the coronation made me realize that strength doesn't mean pretending to be fearless, she had written. If the king can be vulnerable and still be a leader, maybe I can be honest about my struggles and still pursue my dreams. That letter was now framed on William's desk, a reminder that his willingness to be human in his most public moment had created permission for others to embrace their own humanity. Catherine entered the office carrying their youngest son, Louis, who had fully recovered from his coronation day illness and was now chattering happily about his morning in the palace gardens. The sight of his family immediately shifted William's focus from public duties to personal joy, a balance he was still learning to maintain as king. "Papa, Mrs. Henderson says there are people outside with signs about you," Louis announced with a matter-of-fact tone that only 5-year-old children could manage when discussing complex political situations. "What kind of signs?" William asked, lifting his son onto his lap. "Some say nice things, and some say not nice things, but she says that's what happens when you're important and people care what you do." The wisdom of a palace housekeeper, filtered through a child's innocence, captured something profound about the nature of modern leadership. Public disagreement wasn't necessarily a sign of failure. It could be evidence of engagement and investment in the nation's future. Outside the palace gates, the daily gathering of protesters and supporters had evolved into something more complex than traditional demonstrations. Dr. Marcus Webb, a sociology professor who had been studying the phenomenon, observed that the groups were increasingly engaging in actual dialogue rather than just expressing opposing viewpoints. What's remarkable is seeing Republican activists having genuine conversations with monarchist supporters, he noted in his research. The king's example of acknowledging different perspectives seems to have created space for more nuanced discussion about the role of tradition in modern society. The change was visible in other ways, too. Social media conversations about the monarchy were becoming more sophisticated, moving beyond simple pro- or anti-monarchy positions to explore questions about representation, service, and the meaning of citizenship in the 21st century. Emma Bradford, the royal correspondent who had covered the coronation, found herself writing different kinds of stories than she had in 15 years of royal reporting. Instead of focusing solely on protocol and pageantry, she was exploring how the monarchy's evolution reflected broader social changes in Britain. The king's willingness to engage with criticism has paradoxically made the institution seem more secure rather than more vulnerable, she wrote in her latest piece. By acknowledging that not everyone supports the monarchy, he's made it easier for skeptics to engage constructively rather than simply opposing from the outside. This shift was particularly evident in Commonwealth nations, where the relationship with the British Crown had long been complicated by colonial history. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, Republican movements that had gained momentum in recent years were beginning to engage in more nuanced discussions about constitutional reform rather than demanding immediate abolition. The king's approach seemed to be creating space for evolution rather than revolution, for gradual change rather than dramatic rupture. It was a delicate balance that required constant attention and adjustment. William's first major test as king came when he decided to visit a struggling former mining community in northern England that had been particularly critical of the monarchy on social media. The visit hadn't been planned by his staff. It was his own initiative, prompted by reading about unemployment and poverty in the region that had reached crisis levels. The advance team was nervous about the reception he would receive. Social media monitoring showed significant Republican sentiment in the area, and there was a real possibility of embarrassing protests or hostile confrontations that could damage his still fragile reputation. But William was determined to engage directly with critics rather than only meeting supporters. If I'm going to be king of everyone, I need to listen to everyone, especially those who question my relevance to their lives, he told his staff during the planning meeting. The visit to Milford, a town where the last mine had closed 5 years earlier, was unlike any royal visit in recent memory. William spent the day in genuine conversation with unemployed workers, struggling single mothers, and young people who saw no future in their hometown. The conversations were difficult and sometimes uncomfortable. People expressed anger about government policies, frustration with economic inequality, and skepticism about whether the monarchy had any role to play in addressing their real problems. But something unexpected happened as the day progressed. William's willingness to listen without defending, to ask genuine questions about their experiences, and to acknowledge the limitations of his understanding began to shift the dynamic from confrontation to conversation. Mary Thompson, a 54-year-old former mine worker who had been unemployed for 3 years, found herself explaining to the king the daily reality of choosing between heating and food. Her initial plan had been to boycott the visit entirely, but curiosity had brought her to the community center where William was meeting with residents. "I didn't expect him to actually listen," she told a local reporter afterward. "I mean really listen, not just nod politely and move on. When I told him about my situation, he asked follow-up questions that showed he was trying to understand, not just get through the conversation." The visit generated extensive social media coverage, but the tone was markedly different from the coronation commentary. Instead of focusing on protocol or appearance, the conversation centered on substance and sincerity. Videos of William's interactions with community members showed a leader genuinely engaged with learning about problems he couldn't solve with ceremonial gestures. The impact extended far beyond Milford. Other struggling communities began requesting similar visits, seeing an opportunity for their voices to be heard at the highest levels of society. The traditional model of royal visits to showcase successful projects was expanding to include engagement with ongoing challenges and failures. This evolution in royal duties reflected William's growing understanding that modern monarchy needed to be more than symbolic. It needed to be substantively engaged with the real lives and struggles of citizens. The crown could be a platform for amplifying unheard voices rather than just celebrating established achievements. As autumn approached, the transformation in public perception of the new king became undeniable. Polling showed that while support for monarchy as an institution remained divided along generational and political lines, personal approval for William's approach to the role had increased significantly across all demographics. More importantly, the nature of public discourse about the monarchy had evolved. The binary choice between uncritical support and hostile opposition had given way to more sophisticated discussions about the role of tradition in a changing society. Young people who had initially dismissed the coronation as irrelevant pageantry were beginning to engage with questions about service, responsibility, and the meaning of national identity. Older citizens who had worried about the monarchy's survival were finding hope in its capacity for authentic evolution. The change wasn't just about William personally. It reflected a broader shift in how institutions could maintain relevance and legitimacy in an age of digital transparency and democratic skepticism. By choosing engagement over isolation, vulnerability over invincibility, and service over ceremony, the new king had demonstrated a path forward that other traditional institutions were beginning to study and emulate. On a quiet evening in December, William stood on the balcony of Buckingham Palace looking out over London's lights. The city stretched endlessly before him, home to millions of people whose lives he was now committed to serving. The weight of that responsibility remained enormous, but it no longer felt crushing. Catherine joined him, wrapping a coat around her shoulders against the winter chill. They stood together in comfortable silence, reflecting on the months that had transformed not just their lives, but their understanding of what modern leadership could look like. "Do you think we've made a difference?" Catherine asked, her voice soft in the evening air. "I think we've made a beginning," William replied. "The real test isn't whether people like us or approve of what we're doing. It's whether we can help create space for the conversations and connections that democracy needs to function." Below them, London continued its eternal rhythm of ambition and struggle, hope and disappointment, tradition and change. The city that had witnessed 1,000 years of royal history was now watching a new chapter being written, one that acknowledged both the weight of the past and the possibilities of the future. The social media eruption that had threatened to define his early reign had instead become the catalyst for a deeper transformation. By choosing to engage authentically with criticism rather than dismissing it, William had discovered that vulnerability could be a source of strength, that admitting uncertainty could enhance rather than undermine authority. As they turned to go inside, William felt a quiet confidence about the path ahead. The crown would always be heavy, the criticism would never disappear entirely, and the challenges facing the nation would continue to evolve. But he had learned that authentic leadership in the digital age required the courage to be genuinely human in the most public of roles. The new dawn of his reign was not marked by the absence of criticism or the presence of universal approval, but by the quality of engagement between monarch and citizens that made both sides more thoughtful, more empathetic, and more committed to the hard work of building a society worthy of its highest ideals. The story of King William V had only just begun, but its opening chapters suggested a monarchy that could evolve without abandoning its essential purpose: to serve as a symbol of national unity while remaining grounded in the real experiences and aspirations of the people it represented.